What do the most successful, growing businesses have in common? They're working together in Slack. Slack is where work happens, with all your people, data, and information in one AI-powered place. Grow your business in Slack. Visit slack.com to get started.
I'm Inc. Executive Editor Diana Ransom.
And I'm Editor-at-Large Christine Lagorio-Chafkin.
And you're listening to From the Ground Up. Today's episode, Nailing Product Market Fit. Last week, we had a fascinating discussion with Michelle Cordeiro-Grant of Gorgie and Stephen and Brittany Yeng of Skrewball Whiskey. When launching their companies, they had very different approaches to testing their product with customers and finding their biggest fans.
Yes, and both of those approaches worked. That left us wondering, how much flexibility does the conventional wisdom have here? How many different approaches to product market fit are there? And has anyone been shown to be the most successful?
Would maybe a Harvard Business School professor know?
Yes, indeed. I talked with Jeff Bussgang. He's a senior lecturer at the Harvard Business School where he teaches a course called Launching Technology Ventures. He's also a co-founder and general partner at Flybridge Capital Partners, an early-stage venture capital firm, where he encounters and works with companies going through this process all of the time. He told me not only about some of the methods he teaches, but that you might have a higher likelihood of success if you start with the market rather than the product. We also talked about the effect AI has had on early-stage startups testing their market, and about some of the ethical considerations that put pressure on the process and that disproportionately affect BIPOC and women founders.
Oh, interesting. Did he have anything to say about the different takes on finding customers that we talked about in our last episode?
Yes, he did. They actually fit two kind of traditional approaches he teaches, top-down and bottom-up. But I'll let him explain that.
Yeah, so the first thing that you have to think about as a founder is that your startup is an experimentation machine. So the whole goal of that early journey from 0 to 1 is how do you construct an experimentation machine and run a series of experiments that test your value proposition, your go-to-market, and all sorts of other hypotheses. Now, what's interesting about your story is that there are two really important methods for running and designing experiments. There's the bottoms-up method, which is you don't know what's going to work. You don't have a really strong initial hypothesis or instinct. And so you try a bunch of different experiments and do deep customer discovery and customer research and use those research elements and results to inform your product market fit journey. The second approach is more of a top-down hunch-driven approach where you have a point of view. Maybe it's informed from your own experience as a previous executive or as a user. Maybe it's informed from your research if you're a scientist. But you have a strong point of view, and there you design an experiment based on your strong point of view or your hypothesis or your hunch. So those are the two different ways, but in all cases, you have to run a series of experiments in a very disciplined fashion. And the trick for startups is to maximize learning, not maximize growth during those early days of experimentation.
Right. Yeah, you teach that experimental design has a lot to do with finding your customers, right? Can you break down for me a little bit about what kind of experiments founders should run?
Yeah, so the first thing we focus on is customer value proposition experiments. And the first subset of that really matters is who is your customer? And it's such a simple question. It sounds so basic, but one of the things I talk about in my class is your initial customer selection is your destiny. The who that you decide to focus on and a very narrow definition of who really sets the tone for the entire business construction. And I've had founders come back to me 6 years later, 8 years later and tell me, Jeff, I thought I knew who my customer was, and it took me 6 or 8 years to figure it out. I had the wrong ideal customer profile or ICP in mind. I didn't really understand my user persona. I had too broad a group of customers in mind. I let my ambition kind of cloud me from really finding that narrow first set. So the first thing, Christine, that you've really got to nail is the who and as narrow a definition as possible so you can really focus on understanding their needs.
Yeah, but it sounds like at first you have to keep a really open mind about where that narrow group is found, right? Have you had any students, the one you mentioned might be a good example, but find an unexpected customer that wasn't what they were initially looking at?
All the time. I'll give you one example. We have so I'm an investor at Flybridge, as you know, a venture capitalist in addition to my teaching. And so I invest in many of my students after they graduate. And so I get to follow them and follow their journeys. And so as an example, one of our companies, was co-founded by a former student, is a company called BrightHire. It's an interview intelligence platform. It's an AI software company that allows you to analyze and deconstruct interviews and provide analytics and intelligence, and also allow hiring managers to watch the playlist of the interviews, like the Spotify playlist, to see how different candidates answer different questions across all the interviews. Their initial customer, they thought that would really care about this, were recruiters. Those recruiters were high volume and be more sophisticated about their use of technology. And they spent a bunch of time with recruiters, and they soon realized that, recruiters weren't actually the wow in terms of the value proposition, because recruiters are doing all the interviews themselves. The real wow is going to be the hiring managers themselves, who are outsourcing interviews to recruiters, to colleagues, and they want to know what's going on in those interviews, and they want to see how candidates are answering particular questions. And they care about having interview notes automatically generated through AI. And so they pivoted from recruiters as their initial customer to talent executives, and that proved to be incredibly useful. And then their second move has been going up market. They initially focused on smaller companies, but they realized that higher transaction hiring was a better fit for such a robust platform. And they realized that they could evolve their platform over time to be even more compelling for larger companies. So they've gone from initially recruiters to then small business tech companies that were hiring to now larger companies, and companies like HCA and some of the largest Fortune 1000 companies. So that journey of figuring out the who and figuring out the product market fit in the context of the who is a journey I see time and time again, just like the one BrightHire went through.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a journey that often does change over time too, as the product evolves and as the customer sometimes evolves.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, one of the things we talk a lot about is the initial customer and the initial application is the head pin in a bowling alley. And so you want to get the right head pin, but over time you can add more customer segments, and over time you can add more applications and keep, running the gamut. But if you have a really focused approach on that single head pin, you can worry about market size later. Just nail that initial head pin and really crush it.
Interesting. So I imagine that where your students and the founders that you work with are finding customers to test on is changing. I mean, I'm thinking of really early stage companies just trying to get their product in front of any other eyes that are not their own, not their families. How has that been changing, and how much does it vary company to company or product to product? I mean, getting a beverage into people's hands is a lot different than, say, getting software, right?
Yeah, it does vary, but the thing that's most important is doing just a deep customer research. And Scott Cook, the founder of Intuit, had this great follow me home philosophy, which is when somebody buys Intuit software like Quicken and whatnot, he would follow them home and watch how they use that software so that he could look over their shoulder, literally, not just figuratively.
I mean, that sounds a little creepy.
A little creepy. A little creepy. He was able to pull it off somehow. He's very persuasive, like all good entrepreneurs. And it led to being a very valuable company. But the point being, really understanding empathetically what your customer is going through. And that's true of whether it's a consumer or a business, a large business or a small business. Really deeply understanding your customer, really doing the hard work, the customer discovery, the research. That's the key unlock. One of my founders had this great line. She said, Jeff, after a couple of years, I realized that I wasn't in love with the problem and I wasn't in love with the solution. I'm in love with my customers. Like, I love my customers, and I'm really obsessed with my customers, and whatever problems they have, I want to solve. And that's what great founders do.
Interesting. Do you feel like it's more difficult these days to get that amount of time from a customer or a potential customer? Are there ways you advise founders, like how to connect with them?
It's actually an indication, early signal of product market fit. If you try to speak to a customer about a problem that they don't really care about, that's not a top 2 or 3 priority, or what I like to refer to as a hair on fire value proposition or a hair on fire problem. If you're not addressing a top issue, then they don't want to spend time with you. They're too busy. So yeah, if you're not addressing a pressing need and you're having a hard time getting customer time to even talk to you about your product, to even give you the ability to react to your prototype or your V1, maybe you don't have the right value proposition. So that's another test on, who is your target customer, be really narrow in that persona definition, and then try to find the things that they care the most about and are willing to spend time with you talking about.
So let me ask you something sort of basic here. This concept of product market fit, right? It's kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? And some founders might have a market in mind before they have a product in mind. Some may have a product first and then just need to find the market. How do you kind of talk about that? Are there any theories that have been tested there about which way works best, or has a higher degree of likelihood of survival as a company?
Yeah, having a market first or customer first approach tends to be a better approach, candidly, Christine. So
wow, so this should be called market product fit, not product market fit.
That's right. That's right. We're using the wrong language. But many founders fall in love with their product and they think their product is like, everything's a nail and they've got a hammer and they're just looking to hammer it home. So I really do encourage founders to take a market-focused view. That's why I start with the who and the user and the user journey and the needs and the requirements and doing that deep research and then developing whatever the product is that meets that hair on fire value proposition. Now, there is a type of exception here, and that is there are breakthrough technologies. There are dislocations, whether it's synthetic biology or genetic engineering or AI, which maybe we'll talk more about. And when you have these technology dislocations, you can begin with the technology insight, and then you can say, okay, I've got this amazing insight about this technology. Who cares the most about this? Or how do I shape this to be a fit? So there's one case that I teach in my class about C16 Bio, which is a synthetic palm oil company. They created this synthetic biology invention out of MIT. One of my former Harvard Business School students teamed up with these MIT PhDs, and they said, what do we do with synthetic palm oil? And they began to realize who cared most about synthetic palm oil? Well, it's going to be food companies and personal care companies. And then they began to formulate a replacement for palm oil, which is so destroying of the environment for, deforestation, for food companies and personal care companies. So that was a nice example of starting with a market, a product or a technology, and then finding the market for that technology.
You mentioned AI. Let's just go there. I'm curious. The thing I kind of wanted to talk about that I thought AI might be within your answer is like what's changed in the last few years about the way you're teaching. Finding product market fit and different methodologies that you can use in terms of doing that research, locating customers, that sort of thing. I would just love to open that topic up for you.
Yeah, there are two ways that I approach it. One is I'm using AI in the classroom, and I can go into more detail on that, custom chat bots and various exercises that I've built.
Have you built a Jeff bot yet?
I have. So my class is called Launching Tech Ventures, LTV, and I created a chat bot customized for the class and the curriculum called Chat LTV, and it's a faculty co-pilot, and it's effectively allowing the students to interact with me and my content and ask any questions about the course and the course curriculum.
Oh, neat. So you don't need to talk to your students anymore?
Well, I still speak to them. But one of the things I noticed when I launched the bot is the most popular time window for the students to interact with the bot, not surprisingly, 11 p.m. to 3 a.m.
Oh.
I don't want to talk to my students during that time window.
No, absolutely. So it's sort of, maybe it's a party trick. They can talk to their professor.
I think it's less a party trick and more of a last minute prep tool, let's say, before the class the next morning.
And how else does AI inform the class and your teachings?
Yeah, so the second way I've been obsessed with how to use these modern AI tools to accelerate the product market fit journey and to run these set of experiments even more efficiently and effectively. And I've seen a whole range of things, both through my HBS work, through my students, but also in my investing work at Flybridge and at the venture capital firm, where our portfolio companies and my student founders are leveraging AI to do all the things I'm talking about more efficiently. So I'll give you a couple examples. One is user persona and customer research and customer discovery. You mentioned a minute ago that it's harder to get the attention of consumers and of businesses to bounce your ideas off of them. What many are doing is they're creating synthetic customer profiles and personas using the AI tools, and then querying those customer profiles in order to chatting with them and other mechanisms in order to get feedback on product ideas. In fact, one of my faculty colleagues, Ayelet Israeli, did a very extensive research project on user personas, AI applied user personas, and found that the AI was giving responses very similar to human responses in market research, so that the quality of the responses was very good. So there's an ability now for founders to have, both for themselves and for their teams, a far more efficient market research and customer discovery process through the AI tools.
Yeah, so interesting. I suppose this all hasn't quite been tested yet, but it seems promising for at least chatting with a constructed identity, if not a real person.
Yeah, it's been extremely effective. And as I said, my colleague Ayelet Israeli did do some research on this topic and found that the responses were really high quality.
You're a growing business, which means you need every spare hour you can find. That's why the most successful, growing businesses are working together in Slack. Slack is where work happens, with all your people, data, and information in one AI-powered place. Start a call instantly in huddles and ditch cumbersome calendar invites. Or build an automation with Workflow Builder to take routine tasks off your plate. No coding required. Grow your business in Slack. Visit slack.com to get started.
Another area of great interest has been, of course, prototype development. The tools are incredibly effective at rapid prototyping. There are a number of no-code and low-code tools that exist today. But with the AI platforms, you can now have non-technical users build prototypes very efficiently. And now the joke is that the new coding language is English, that founders can use English language prompts to generate prototypes in code. And it's one former student who's a founder shared with me, it's extremely rapidly accelerated his ability to run experiments and try out different ideas and get them in front of customers.
Yeah. Okay. So if someone came to you at Flybridge and said, our product is just testing super well with these AI personas we've constructed, would you invest?
Well, we do make pre-seed and seed investments. That's our focus. So we do invest pre-product market fit, and we're always looking for signals to indicate product market fit. And so we would factor that into our calculus. Absolutely.
Okay. So not a no. Let's talk about some additional case studies. I know that oftentimes as a company grows, it has to kind of keep these early stage lessons in mind, right? About making sure that your product is the right fit for its customers, or if its customers are evolving, making sure that the product evolves too, right? Have you seen do you have any interesting case studies there about making pivots, not in the early days, but as the company is growing to continue to fit the best customers?
We talk a lot in my class about pivots, and one example that many of your listeners may be familiar with is Classpass. It's a very popular gym subscription app and service centered in New York City and now all around the country.
Yeah, Pyle, I believe was on the last iteration of this podcast.
Amazing. So I don't know if she talked about her many pivots, but we have the Classpass case as one of our cases in my HBS class. And one of the things I think is so interesting about her journey, from initially a search engine and open table bookings platform, and that didn't work, to more of a Groupon approach, and that didn't really work, to a subscription approach, is that the first subscription approach took off, but it took off almost too well. As she said, power users almost killed the company because they had this unlimited plan. And on the one hand, she wanted to encourage her users to go to the gym, but on the other hand, every time they went to the gym, it cost money to the service. And the power users using the service in the way that the business model was designed ended up being excellent product market fit, but a bad business model. And so they had to adjust, as you well know, to have ceilings and packages and different pricing and evolve and tweak their model over time. So you see that often, that startups, they run these experiments, they learn, they realize the impact on their business model, and then they have to adjust.
Yeah, I love that example because it wasn't one where the simplest answer is right? It took a lot. It was a very complicated formula that the company had to continue to build to make the economics work.
That's right. It's one of the things we talk a lot in my class about, as you would expect in a HBS classroom, around unit economics and analytics, and really thinking deeply about your lifetime value, which is why the course is called LTV, and your customer acquisition cost and your cost of service and your gross margins, and ultimately the quality of your business model. And one of the things that sometimes founders forget is business model quality leads to valuations. And if you have an inferior business model quality, even if you have usage data and revenue that's very high or very ramping in a hockey stick, you might have a very low valuation. You might not get credit for that value, for that revenue per se, because it's not recurring or it's not high gross margin. You don't have network effects or all the other elements of business model quality.
Absolutely. Okay, you wrote about this fascinating area of ethical considerations that can arise during the search for product market fit. That a founder could be faced with trade-offs with respect to their obligations to their stakeholders, their shareholders. I like this thought. I'm just going to read this to you. And I know this was more of something that you were posing as a question rather than something that seemed super well researched or thought out, but let's just talk about it. Founders are uniquely under a high degree of pressure and uncertainty while operating in organizations that do not yet have mature practices for identifying and resolving ethical and moral issues. You say more broadly, why does the startup ecosystem contain so many market failures that lead to profound biases and inequities, particularly in terms of access to capital for female and BIPOC entrepreneurs? Now, this is super interesting because this is kind of saying like product market fit works for a certain group of people and it might not, yield to the same success for BIPOC or female entrepreneurs due to these funding inequities. So what did that discussion lead to for you? Did you continue that discussion and where's it gone from there?
Yeah, so you're putting on something that I've been kind of obsessed with for a number of years. And I even created a module in my course on this topic because I felt as if our students needed to think more deeply about it. Let's just talk about access to capital. The numbers.
Yeah.
Women and BIPOC founders don't have anywhere near the access to capital that their population proportion would suggest they should. At Flybridge, we've done a number of things in that area, having dedicated funds like X Factor Ventures for female founders and other dedicated initiatives for founders of color. But it's a massive problem, and there's inherent biases in our industry, which for many reasons remain very difficult to overcome. And that's a whole nother conversation we could have. At the same time, founders are moving fast. And the classic Facebook mantra of move fast and break things. Sometimes things are broken that shouldn't be broken. And sometimes lines are crossed that shouldn't be crossed. And you've seen some of the downstream effects in the case of FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried, in the case of Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes, and many other examples. And so there's definitely these gray areas that founders have to navigate. And one of the things I really want my students to be ready for is facing those gray areas and making the right decisions and not allowing the fake it till you make it culture to overcome, their decision making.
You write that these organizations are small. They don't necessarily have mature practices for resolving ethical issues, right? So it's sort of on the founder themselves. And so you're asking your students to consider whether they are able to take that all on really before they're starting out?
Yeah, or to say it a little differently, there are fewer outside forces that can provide controls and governance. Boards of directors are immature. You don't have audits necessarily. You don't have oversight like you would and transparency in the way you would a public company. We as venture capitalists try to do our best to provide for the companies we invest in to provide governance and transparency and controls, but it's an area that's still very gray. And so what I'm trying to convey to my students is you're going to be operating into this gray area where the controls and the governance has to come from you. No one's going to impose that on you. And so be prepared and come in with high conviction that there are certain lines you won't cross, and you want to create a culture where people don't cross that line. Sometimes founders say, well, I didn't know that this was going on in my company. I didn't know that the head of sales was fudging the numbers to make the quarter so that I could report to the board that I was doing well. or I didn't know that the head of marketing was making claims that were inaccurate about our product. So you got to, as a founder, you have to set the tone and create that culture so that everybody on the team knows that there are certain lines that you won't cross.
Right. It's interesting because as an investor, I mean, like venture capitalists would be incentivized to, hope that these founders move faster at every step, right?
It's a really tricky balancing act, Christine, because on the one hand, you want founders to be ambitious and to push the limits and to be aggressive. But on the other hand, you want them to be careful and cautious and to operate within certain boundaries. And holding those two concepts at the same time is a very difficult and nuanced endeavor that all founders and all early stage investors have to do. And that's really what I'm trying to teach my students, that they have to hold those two nuanced concepts at the same time and navigate through them.
Yeah. And what about BIPOC founders? I mean, and the venture capital or even seed stage, any funding ecosystem that they're looking into. Do you have any advice for them on how to approach it?
Yeah, I teach a class called Scaling Minority Businesses, where we focus very particularly on the access to capital and access to customers and some of these challenges. And there has been since the murder of George Floyd, there's been a growing number of capital sources available to BIPOC founders. That's a good thing. There are more BIPOC decision makers and check writers and big funds. That's a good thing. But it's still a challenge that needs to be overcome. And there's really no silver bullet. It requires, for founders of color, for female founders, they need to find investors that are going to treat them with respect and evaluate their idea and give them the opportunity to win on their own merits and be open-minded.
Right. And are there any lessons in terms of just product design or that very early stage stuff that comes with this ethical concern that you've been raising? Are there anything you can translate into real concrete teachings or takeaways here for our audience?
Yeah, the thing I would say is that there are biases in your organization, and you yourself as a founder have biases. And so the trick is to try to bring in systems and processes that combat those biases. So, for example, a former student of mine is an engineer at Snap, the makers of Snapchat, and he's Black, and he discovered that the camera didn't recognize Black faces as effectively as white faces. So the models, and this is very common in AI models today, the models were trained on a certain data set and not on another data set, more white faces versus Black faces. So he raised the flag and now is product manager in charge of DEI and efficacy of multicultural recognition at Snapchat, which is an amazing position to be in that affects hundreds of millions of users, maybe billions. So I think it's this idea of recognize that there are inherent biases in these models and these systems in your own customer and user research, and try to create processes and try to surround yourself with people who can help you overcome those biases.
Great. What else has shifted in terms of our understanding of product market fit over the last few years, and where do you think it's going? Like what sort of research are you doing now, or what changes are you anticipating?
The biggest change to the product market fit journey in this moment is the advent of AI tools, full stop. Leveraging AI tools to compress your product market fit journey. And there's this, to say something that's a bit of a derivative of a commonly used phrase nowadays, AI is not going to replace founders, but founders who use AI effectively are going to replace founders who don't use AI effectively. So that's the challenge for founders and entrepreneurs in your audience and around the world, is how to be the one that is most effective at leveraging the AI tools.
Thank you so much for your time today, Jeff. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your insights.
Yeah, my pleasure, Christine. Great to see you.
You too. That's all for today's episode of From the Ground Up.
Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice. Also, if you liked today's episode or have suggestions on what topics you'd like to hear about, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or reach out to us on Ink's social channels on LinkedIn, X, or Instagram.
From the Ground Up is produced by Julia Shu, Blake Odom, and Avery Miles. Mix and sound design by Nicholas Torres. Our executive producer is Josh Christensen. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.